Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hendricks, and today's guest, his name is Josh. He has a very interesting career helping people, and he is a prosthetist. Hey, Josh, how you doing?
I am well. Thanks for having me on, Tim. It's been a treat listening to your interviews you've done, and I'm excited to be a part of this.
Oh, well, thanks. I appreciate that. So let's go ahead and get right to it like we always do. Go ahead and tell us where you were born, a little bit about your upbringing, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Oregon actually, but I don't have many memories. I was about two whenever my parents moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that's where I grew up. My brothers and I were pretty blessed to grow up in a pretty stable environment. Yeah, same childhood home. My parents are pastors there and in Oklahoma, still pastoring the same church they moved to back when I was 2 years old. And yeah, it's been fun and life has kind of taken me a little bit farther away, but ended up finding my way back here in Texas, so not too far away from home.
Great state of Texas. They're proud of their state, I've picked up. So, yeah. So, were there any early influences? Your line of work is such a unique one, and I don't know if most folks typically kind of find themselves in that line of work, or you want to basically, for anybody listening, explain what your line of work actually is and what you do before we get going any further.
Yeah. So, my official job title is a prosthetist. I'm an individual, I'm a practitioner for a company, and we provide prosthetic legs. Primarily, I'm certified to do arms and even on some orthotic side, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the essence of my job is, in the simplest way, is I fit and make prosthetic legs for people that have amputations in their lower extremities.
Hmm. What was it that drew you to that career? How did you find yourself going to school to learn how to do this?
Yeah. I, actually am one of the rare, I guess you could say, rare amputees, where having an amputation myself has actually enhanced my career. I knew from a very young age, um, that like I was probably 14 years old whenever I knew this is what I want to do, and it was a result of being an amputee myself. I grew up with a birth deformity that there were several procedures that tried to save the foot, but by the time I was about 2.5 years old, they went ahead and amputated um, portion of my right lower limb, and had a prosthesis ever since. So exposed to it at a young age, and knew pretty soon that this is what I want to do.
What types of early, I guess, experiences did you have with prosthetic devices to where you thought this is the kind, you said at 14 you wanted to get into this? What was kind of the catalyst besides having that? Was it just wanting to help others or wanting to better your personal situation, or both?
Well, yeah, I mean, it definitely was both. I mean, I'd be lying if I said, I didn't have, probably a vested personal interest
Oh,
in
sure.
that. But I mean, I would say the biggest influencing factor for me was growing up. My prosthetists in the children's hospital were also amputees, and so for me as a patient, I just felt incredibly connected with them. I felt like they knew what they were, not necessarily they knew what they were doing because of that, but they knew what I was going through because they also had an
Sure.
amputation. And so I went through like a couple, I don't know, maybe a year or two between like 14 and later on whenever I actually went ahead and did it, where I questioned and was like, is this really what I want to do? But at the end of the day, I always knew this is what I want to do. And a lot of that was because of the influence that those prosthetists had on me as an amputee and practitioner.
Are there classes in high school that you can take to kind of prepare yourself for this, or do you really kind of hit the ground from square one when you start college?
Yeah, I mean, so formal classes, no, not really. I mean, there might be, but I've never heard of them. You're gonna have your high school classes that have your science, tech, engineering based or geared towards that, then the student could kind of lean into that. I've got a high school student that I'm actually working with now, and she's in one of those science and technology classes that gives her the freedom to kind of choose what kind of career she want to lean into. And so she reached out to us, and I've been able to kind of in afternoon hours after her school show her what we do, but it's not through a formal classroom setting by any means.
I would assume that anatomy is probably a pretty common core class that everybody would have to take, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, well, like I guess I'd say this: the education requirements to become a prosthetist have changed quite a bit, even in the past 20, 30 years, from kind of more of an apprenticeship um, approach to needing a bachelor's degree and then an apprenticeship as well, and now it's a master's degree. But to answer your
Oh.
question, yeah, yeah, it's you got to have your bachelor's degree that has quite a few prerequisites in order to get into the master's degree, and anatomy and physiology are at the top of that list for sure.
Are there specific schools in the United States, since that's where we're located, that are the kind of the meccas that you go to for this line of work, or do most universities have a program for your career?
Yeah, so the current, path that is overwhelmingly the most common, um, is you get your bachelor's degree, and it can really be, um, for the most part, it can really be in whatever you want to study, but it has to require or meet the prerequisite requirements from the graduate schools. So, typically, for an individual who's wanting to get into prosthetics, they're going to do a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering is probably the most common. There's a lot of kinesiology, pre-physical therapy, some biology. That kind of majors will satisfy the prereqs for the graduate studies. I've got a friend of mine who actually her bachelor's degree was in art, and she was a sculptor and did that for a while, and then kind of came into prosthetics and had to go back to school to satisfy those prerequisites. But the undergraduate is really pretty open. It's that master's degree that is pretty specified.
Hmm. You had said at the beginning that your company can kind of do everything, but you primarily focus on the lower extremities. Do folks typically pick an area of specialization, or do you come out of your education being able to do everything and then you pick I can assume that if someone needed a lower arm, that they would want to focus on that, or hands or something. How does the specialization kind of play out?
Yeah, yeah. So it's similar to kind of what you alluded to there. Um, so prosthetics is actually really just about half the side of the industry of what I'm in. It's really prosthetics and orthotics. So the orthotic side is going to be your custom bracing, not always custom bracing, but typically it's going to be those custom molded braces for an individual that may have a condition, whether it was a stroke or a neuropathic condition where they obviously have their limbs, but they don't function the same way that they're intended to. And so there's the bracing side, and then there's the prosthetic side, which is for individuals that don't have their arms or legs. And so the master's degree really equips individuals to come out of the program fully certified or ready to take their board exams to become certified in both orthotics and prosthetics. I would say, and don't quote me on this, but I think I heard last year that 95% of individuals that graduate from their master's degree get certified in both prosthetics and orthotics. So
Okay.
typically it's pretty common to hear CPO, certified prosthetist orthotist, but after that you can kind of see some areas of specialization. Um, You can have folks that work in a hospital setting that mostly do some of those custom bracing. You can have folks that do prosthetic only. There's scoliosis is another pretty large part of the industry for custom back braces. Um, and then yeah, you'll see different settings and then different companies specialize in different things. There's also like cranial remolding helmets for little babies that have some flat spots on their head that need to be rounded out. And so there's quite a few different areas for specialization. Upper extremity is definitely one of them as well, upper extremity prosthetics. But for me, it was being a lower extremity amputee. It's what I was exposed to for my whole life, and even before I got into graduate school. Um, yeah, I knew that that was really where my heart was at and what I wanted to be doing, and so I didn't spend a ton of time doing the orthotics side. I did go through the certification, or the no, I didn't get certified in orthotics, but I did get through the education requirements, so I'm eligible for the orthotic side, but it's just not something that I've really pursued.
The test that you had mentioned a minute ago that folks have to take, is that just a written exam or is there a practical portion to it?
Oh, I wish it was just a written exam. It's yeah, it's actually yeah, I think they're working on making it smaller. In fact, I know they are. I don't know how where they're at in that process, but basically, as it stands now, um, after you're all right. So I'll just kind of run you through the whole timeline, and maybe this is long-winded answer of a simple question, but you get your undergraduate degree. Then you go and get your master's degree. The master's degree is in orthotics and prosthetics. There's about 12 to 13 schools across the US that offer that degree. After the degree of master's, then you get your residency. The residency is about a year and a half long on average, sometimes more and sometimes less. And then after you finish your residency, then what you are referred to as a board eligible practitioner. And so, as it stands now, there's separate um, board exams for prosthetics and orthotics. So there's a combined written exam, which is about 200 questions long. You take that at like a local testing facility. There's a computer simulation exam for prosthetics and a computer simulation exam for orthotics, where it's like, I don't know, 7 or 8 scenarios, patient scenarios, and you have to work through the treatment plan and how you would treat this patient, what you would do with certain clinical results. And then there's also the separate um, clinical practice management prosthetic exam and clinical practice management orthotic exam. And these exams are about 4 hours long each, and you have to fly to Tampa Bay, Florida to take those. So in total, you're looking at
Good
five.
grief.
Yeah, it's kind of insane. That's why, like, for me, I just did the prosthetic ones, and I'm eligible to do the orthotic ones, but I don't practice orthotics. I'm frankly not very good at it. And being a patient myself, I wouldn't want to go to a practitioner that's fitting me for something that they're not familiar with. So that's kind of been an influencing factor why I haven't done it. But then, yeah, you look at the 5 total exams and you're like, okay, I'm going to try and shave off as much of that as I can. But
I don't blame you one bit.
yeah, yeah,
So,
it's quite a bit.
as somebody who I don't have any exposure to prosthetics, the devices themselves, for someone like me who just wants, I'm just curious about what, like if someone has lost their leg from the knee down, what types of materials are you using in today's uh, your field? Is it carbon fiber? Is it stainless steel, titanium? What makes up the bulk of the actual materials that make the devices?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, probably I think the probably easiest way of answering that is to kind of break apart the components of the prosthesis, and just the simplest way, you have the socket, which is the portion of the prosthesis that the residual limb actually goes down into. And this is custom fit, and it's a pretty involved process, but the residual limb is fit down into that, and then the socket is connected to the foot in a below the knee. example like you're saying. And so the socket is typically comprised of an it kind of depends on it depends on the design if patients have a certain fabric or logo or something that they want to have on there, but typically it's going to be a carbon fiber or fiberglass weave that is impregnated with an acrylic resin under vacuum, and that's the socket, and then there's an attachment plate that's laminated in there as well that will give you the structural integrity to connect the socket to the foot. And that's typically aluminum, titanium, or stainless steel, kind of depending on the weight of the components and the weight of the individual. So if the individual has a higher weight, you have to use a little bit heavier metals, but the objective is to always keep the weight of the prosthesis as low as possible. And then obviously the foot is comprised of few different options. There's a glass composite that we see quite a bit. There's also carbon fiber. It's just probably the most common for prosthetic feet. Um, there's some softer foam type feet for individuals that may not need quite as much spring, for lack of better words. But those are your typical materials that we're working with.
How does the fluidity, as far as the natural gait that you would have, how is that replicated in a prosthetic device? Are there springs to return it back, or how does that kind of play out, the mechanics of it?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely come a long ways over the years when you think back to the old wooden legs and ways that this field once
Yeah.
was. A lot more research and science has gone into um, the exact type of carbon layups that are needed to provide the energy return for the patient, as well as different types of feet. So now you see a lot more common hydraulic ankles that can have that natural tibial progression, which is just a way of describing that smooth gait pattern to where you're not seeing this kind of step two gait or that hyperextension at the knee that we can see. But yeah, I would say it's a really fine-tuned process of getting that dynamic alignment dialed in to where you can have an individual who, at times can wear pants and you couldn't tell which leg was the prosthesis and which one wasn't because it is so smooth. And then you have other individuals that aren't able to quite get to that point, and a lot of it has to do with underlying strength and balance. There's just so many factors that influence gait, and so it's my job just to control as much as I can control and make this prosthesis as optimal as we can in alignment. But I would add to it as well, you also have a constant conflict, like with everything in life, between comfort and stability. And so that's also a consideration as well. Whenever you have something that is very giving, it typically does not provide the stability that you need. So that's a consideration that we have to keep in mind whenever we're designing these from an alignment and performance standpoint as well.
When someone comes in and they get fit, and you take the measurements and decide about the materials that you're going to use, then I'm assuming you start building it, and then in the future they come back and they try it on for the first time. What what is that experience like? And then how long does it typically take? And I know that there may be no typical time frame, but how long does it typically take for someone when they first have a a prosthetic device for the first time to get used to just normal activities?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, to answer the back end of that question, I know it's a bailout answer, but it really does depend. I know it's like I can't stand it whenever you're like you're a little more specific, but it really does depend because I've got patients and seen patients that have been an amputee and walked out of the door with no walker cane on their first day they got their leg. That's incredibly rare, but it happens.
Hmm.
And then other times it takes weeks and even months to really go from that progression. Typically, a new amputee is going to start just walking in parallel bars or with a walker, and then gradually start to regain some of that strength and balance, and then eventually, depending on the patient's goals, progress to a cane, and at times just jump straight to, okay, I'm just going to do this. And it's scary, it's intimidating, but every patient kind of approaches that differently. And it also kind of depends on this patient setting too. Our company is mostly mobile prosthetics. I'd say like 75% of the patients that I see, I'm actually going to their home or their doctor's office or their work or their physical therapy or
Oh,
you name it. So yeah, I would say that depending on the patient setting, if they're like in a nursing home, for example, that may be a
mhm.
prosthesis that they really only wear, whenever they're doing their therapy sessions. But then I also may have a patient who's in their 30s and is on their feet 16 hours a day, and so they don't have time to gradually progress. They're got to get going. So it just kind of depends on each patient.
Just out of curiosity, how you see people that are in the Olympics or they're running and they have those specific prosthetic devices. I think they're call them blades. Is that kind of the slang term for them?
Yeah,
Um,
pretty accurate.
how do those stay attached to the leg? I don't understand the mechanics of that part.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it depends on the level of the amputation for starters. So if it is an amputation that's above the knee, typically it's the same concept as the way we would attach a normal prosthetic knee. So I described earlier that kind of lamination step in the making of the socket. At the bottom of the socket, there's an attachment plate that is laminated into the socket, and that is pretty universally adopted throughout all different component manufacturers. So you can attach a knee to that portion at the bottom of the socket relatively easily. And then the knee, if it's a running leg in this example, would perform quite differently than a traditional just walking knee, for lack of better words. And then the foot, that blade portion, is then connected to the knee. Typically, depends on the height of the individual and the clearance that we have to work with, just meaning the space between the bottom of that knee and the floor. But there's typically what we refer to as a tube clamp and a pylon system that's connected to some adapters, male and female adapters. So it's a pretty modular system that allows us to
Hmm.
make it as tall or as short. Um, and then if it's leaning or anything like that, that's kind of where the alignment comes in. I would say for a below the knee running leg, um, there's two of the primary, and really two of the only ways that I'm familiar with on fabricating a running leg for a below the knee amputee. You're going to have either a distal attachment, which is the same principle as your traditional prosthesis, where that running blade um, comes out throughout the back, but then comes back underneath the bottom of the socket. That's pretty common, but for your high Paralympic runners, you're typically going to see that running blade attach on the back end of the socket, referred to as a posterior mount or posterior attachment. And the fabrication for that can be pretty tricky, but it simulates the calf muscle quite a bit better than a distal attachment plate, and so that's why you see that used most of the time in those high performance, um, like Olympics and whatnot.
You had mentioned a little bit ago that the ankle movement, I believe, was hydraulic in nature.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there any, then this is kind of a bit of a rabbit hole as far as the futuristic side of things. Are we anywhere near electronics and batteries and movements as far as, I remember seeing Star Trek where Luke had a prosthetic hand and, he could move his fingers and things. Are we, it seems like the future is getting closer and closer, but is that stuff kind of on the fringe working its way in, or is that still science fiction?
Yeah, yeah, no, it absolutely is already working its way in. So I would say that um, so for the ankle, um, we see very common hydraulic ankles are used. Not always, kind of depending again on the goals and the needs and the strength of that individual. Um, there's nothing too crazy fancy about the hydraulic ankle aside from the ability to manually adjust the resistance settings. But there's no electronic components to it. The next step up from that, as far as the ankle is concerned, is a microprocessor ankle. Um, and they're approved through Medicare. So we do see that they're used. There's a little bit of other concerns you have to consider whenever doing microprocessor ankles. The weight of that can be pretty extreme compared to a conventional foot and ankle system. Um, but they're approved and they work really well for the right individuals. And then I would say knees are microprocessor knees are incredibly common, even for lower activity individuals. Can be approved for microprocessor knees, or you can just have a traditional mechanical knee as well. So that's pretty common. I would say that for like the Star Trek that you're referring to, when you go into I know, right? When you go to upper extremity, um, the electronics change from a control standpoint. Um, so you don't necessarily refer to an upper extremity arm that's electronic as microprocessor. It's more myoelectric is the common terminology. Just basically, um, if I were to like oversimplify this, the way you control a microprocessor foot or knee is going to be dependent on the ground, and every force is an equal and opposite force to it. So when you're standing, how does that ground um, push back on the knee? And that can be controlled through that alignment. When you go into upper extremity, you're controlling that more through the muscle tissue that is remaining in the residual limb. So you'll see electrodes that are implanted inside the sockets of the arms, and whenever the individual has a muscle belly that they can still actively fire and move, they can trigger that electrode within the socket to control that hand or elbow, or both, to position the way that they desire. Is probably the simplest way of putting it.
Wow. Man, that's crazy. I
Yeah,
mean, that's neat though.
it's really come a long ways.
Yeah. How are this is I feel silly asking this. How are these powered? Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
is there batteries or what?
yeah. That's pretty much it. Battery powered. Battery lives have come a long ways. I actually,
Oh yeah.
I couldn't believe it, but I was in a CEU course last year, and there was this knee that had come out, that had a truly unheard of battery life of up to 15 days, which is
Good grief.
I don't know that I'd put it to the test for that, but it definitely was way more than a few hours at a time. But common practice is just charge it like you charge your phone overnight. If you skip a night,
Mm.
you're probably going to be fine. You skip 2 nights, you may be pushing it, but it's the same process as you charge your phone or anything else.
Does it have a default mode where if you happen to lose power and you're out and about, does it then just perform like a hydraulic or does it stop working altogether?
Yeah, it depends on the manufacturer, right? So kind of back to like the job, I don't know, description. As a practitioner, my job is to evaluate and treat the individual, to fit and fabricate the socket portion, but I don't make the knees or the feet. Those are from companies typically over in Europe, or the most common, but there's several companies in the US and really just kind of all over the world that manufacture the feet and the knees. And so It's my job to pretty much be very knowledgeable of what is out there, what works, what doesn't work, what's indicated for certain patients. And so every manufacturer is going to manufacture their feet and ankles differently, but um, the pretty common trend is if it like loses its battery, that it just goes into stiff mode. So you can still walk on it.
Okay.
It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to simulate any kind of normal gait pattern, but
Right.
it's like a donut tire. You know, you're going to go 50 miles an hour on the max and get home as soon as you can, kind of thing.
What an example. Yeah.
I mean that's maybe that's oversimplifying it, but that's really the best way I know how to put it.
Sure. Did you have to just kind of shift gears when you were in early in your career and you were learning? I know that you had firsthand experience and you were just kind of headed down that path with a familiarity that some folks may not have. But did you have any mentors in your education, or you had mentioned the folks at Children's Hospital that you had a good relationship with, but when you were learning, did you have anybody that you kind of gravitated towards or that was exceptionally influential in your education process?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And there's no way I would be where I'm at now if it wasn't for all the folks that somehow managed to put up with me in those early learning times. I had the benefit of so I went to Baylor College of Medicine down in Houston for my master's program, and Baylor has a little bit of a unique model. They incorporate the residency portion into their curriculum. And so their model is one, it's shared with one, maybe two other schools of the 13 where you go to the school. So I went down to Houston. I did my all my didactic classes, cadaver lab, anatomy, all the prosthetic orthotic courses for a year, and then I went into residency. And what was unique about Baylor is I had the opportunity to travel pretty much all across the country, learning from different practitioners and seeing different types of clinics and hospital settings and small companies and large companies. And every place I went, I was in Fort Worth, Texas. I was in um, Columbia, South Carolina. I was in Salt Lake City, Utah. I spent some time in Kansas City, a little bit of time in Arkansas, and then ended up here in Dallas. And every place I went, it was just um, an incredible learning opportunity. And I had some insane mentors that really knew what they were doing and knew how to teach what they were doing at a very high level. So there's just no doubt I would not have any idea with what I'm doing or where I'm at if it weren't for the folks that kind of helped me along the way.
Is the residency program something that is it a any kind of a paid internship, or is it part of your education where you just have to really plan ahead financially?
Yeah, I mean, so in the traditional path, it is paid, where you would go to your master's degree, you would take a year or two, sometimes like 30 months, I think was one of the longer ones. Um, and you would get your master's degree and graduate there, and then you'd get a residency for a really low salary, like I don't know, 30 to $40,000 maybe, and that's ballparking. I really don't know it. I know it's enough to basically barely make ends meet. Um, and so that's the traditional route. In Baylor, because they incorporate the residency into the curriculum, we didn't get paid, um, but we also graduated a lot faster because the didactic portion was only a year and the residency was a year and a half. So in total, you're looking at 2.5 years. And I know it was like at first when I was looking, I was like, this doesn't make sense. Why would I go there? But when you zoom out and you look at the big timeline, it actually made a tremendous amount of sense because I would graduate and be board eligible sooner. And when you get board eligible, that's whenever you're seeing those, a little bit more uh, appropriate salaries and compensations that make sense. So yeah. with Baylor, I did not get paid. I lived with my
Well, you
grandmother
talked
in
about
Kansas City. Whenever I was in Kansas City
yeah,
for
I know your
residency.
grandma. She's pretty awesome. So yeah. What you mentioned pay, so let's go ahead and touch on that. And I'm not asking you what you make, but what types of salaries? And I know it, I always throw this clause as it depends kind of on where you live. If you live in California or New York, you're going to make more, but it's probably going to cost more to live there. But what can someone ballpark expect to make when they're done with their education and they're first starting out in your line of work?
Yeah, I would say to expect to make just on a general rule of thumb at least $70,000. Um, there's companies that will offer less than that. There's companies that will offer a lot more than that. But I would encourage anybody that's going into the industry to not accept anything less than that. Um, and then from there, it does depend on if you're doing orthotics and prosthetics, if you're just doing prosthetics, um, what kind of company are you working for? The larger companies typically pay less than some of the smaller companies. Um, Not always the case. I've heard large companies that do pay quite a bit more, but the trend that I've noticed has been the opposite. Um, but yeah, you'll see a salary range from anywhere between probably 70 and 100 is common for someone starting out, and then
Okay.
from there, unfortunate reality is just from a billing, and revenue perspective. The orthotic side um, doesn't typically generate the revenue that uh, correlates with the clinical demand to be an expert at that. It's really pretty unfortunate and frustrating, and it's something that is constant battle for us in O&P. Um, Prosthetics is typically the area of the industry that generates a little bit more revenue. Not always the case, depending on the referral source and the streamline that you have of volume of that patient population. But if you're working in a prosthetic only facility or primarily prosthetic facility, you're going to see some of those higher salaries be more common than in a strictly orthotic setting, unfortunately.
Okay. What types of soft skills, if someone wants to get into your line of work, what is there a commonality that you see with the people that do well as far as their depth of the soft skills that they should have?
Oh yeah. Well, I think there's the clinical skill that ultimately comes first. You do at some point pretty early on have to be pretty good, and I'm not being arrogant. I'm just you have to be good and you have to be consistent. Um, because if the leg doesn't fit, it doesn't matter how nice of a person you are. If the patient's in pain, if they can't walk, um, that then everything falls to that. And so that's a clinical skill that has developed over time. But aside from that, I would say the uh, the ability to really um, meet each individual patient with where they're at. We see this in like all of medicine. I'm sure you have too, where you kind of just go in and you feel like a number, and
Yeah.
no one really knows your name. And so with prosthetics being so specialized and being an area of medicine where the area that you're treating is never going to heal. It's unlike some other forms of medicine where the patient heals and you don't see them again. These are typically lifelong patients. Relationships develop over that time, and so that just soft-spoken people skill is probably the most crucial to just really meet that patient where they're at. And I would say honestly, the biggest thing is like just be an attentive listener. Um, that's probably the biggest skill that I think is underrated because a lot of times, there can be maybe redundant or long-winded stories or um, kind of irrelevant information that's brought up in meetings that you just know clinically doesn't apply, and so natural inclination is to just tune it out. But I mean, patients see that, and I see that myself as a patient in past clinical settings where I'm like, I can tell you're not even listening to me. And so, really, really being an attentive listener, asking questions, and um, and then also probably being able to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it is another huge, huge skill to have. I do incorporate in my practice a pretty huge collaborative approach. And I think a lot of that's influenced as a patient myself, where it's pretty rare that I will recommend a prescription on a patient for a certain design, whether it's a foot or suspension or whatever it might be, where I recommend that without telling them that this is what we're doing. Um, I would say that's incredibly rare. Almost every primary clinical decision that we make, I want to make collaboratively with the patient. Um, and unfortunately, that's not done everywhere we go. It's common, but it's not as common as I wish it was. So it's definitely something that I prioritize and really encourage anyone in the industry to make sure that that's something we're doing.
You mentioned something a minute ago that I always ask folks how they recommend or what's their advice for dealing with failure. And when you have someone who comes in and they're trying something on or they've been wearing it for a short amount of time and it's uncomfortable or even painful, something needs to, I mean, this is a custom fit to that individual. And I can imagine and I can appreciate no one will be the same. So if someone comes in and it's just not progressing how you would like, you can't seem to get it right, or just failure in general, what's your approach and what's your advice for anyone coming up behind you that is going to enter your field?
Oh man. Well, I mean, the cliche answer is, learn from it and keep going. And I think that that's cliche because it's true, but I would probably focus on the first part of that as a more common practice for me. The learning from
Mhm.
it really, I think, is not something that is easy to just say it and keep going. Like, analyze it, study it, really, really identify what went wrong, what was the cause for this failure. Don't blow it off. Don't analyze it. Um, but really have a concrete understanding of what it is that went wrong. What are you doing differently to not have the same results? Um, and then, yeah, you then incorporate that into the next patient and the next, clinical application. But I would say the simplest way is just analyze what went wrong, study it, and know um, why the results failed and what we can do differently is the biggest takeaway from that.
You're always just fine tuning your customer service, your empathy, your approach, and just making it better. Even if it's minutely, you're just making it better every time you encounter a patient.
Try to.
Yeah. Every job has things that they like, and every job has things that they dislike. What is it that you like most about your job? And then is there an aspect of your job that you wish you could do away with?
Um, yeah, so I mean, what I like most about my job is probably what you would expect, just seeing the smile on someone's face, get up and walk again. Simple as that may sound, it's incredibly giving. We put a lot of mental oxygen and resources and time and dedication into some of these devices that we're making, and to see the results bear fruit is the biggest reward. Selfishly, I'll admit it, but it is incredibly satisfying, not just for me, but just genuinely for the patient to see um, individuals, the tears running down their face, saying, "Okay, there is life after amputation." Nothing beats that. I would say the thing that I dislike the most, again, the cliche answer for anybody that works in any kind of medicine is going to be health insurance. But in
Yeah.
full transparency, that's really not even what I dislike the most. What I really just hate with everything in me is the mental effect that I see amputation can have on an individual. Um, I've had a handful of patients that have taken their lives because the depression was so severe. Um, I've spoken at a couple different funerals for patients, and so kind of the relationships you build with these patients over time, seeing that not turn out into the results that we, intended is, devastating. But it's the reality that we have to face, and I think that it's also the more you're aware of it, the more you're going to consider those things, even if it's not even clinical relevance, but just like scheduling. I mean, if I have a patient who I know is really, really depressed, um, I'm gonna go out of my way, and if that means I have to stay after 5 o'clock or come in on a weekend or something, I'm gonna do that every single time. If that means that they get their leg 3 days sooner, because um, that's just there's sometimes nothing to hold on to for some of these patients but that leg, and so I take that incredibly seriously.
One of the things that folks may not realize is the human side, the empathetic side, the you're you're not a counselor per se, but you have to be there for people when you're in your line of work. And it's something that maybe I don't know if they prepare you for that. Like when I started in the fire service, there wasn't much talked about as far as when you go and you're in somebody's home that their family member has passed away. How do you deal with that kind of a thing? You may not be prepared for it, but it helps a lot to be aware that this is what you can encounter.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely come a long ways. I think as with everything in this industry, I know that whenever I was down at Baylor, there was some health behavioral classes and some of those mental awareness campaigns that we see kind of in, excuse me, like every industry really now, which is wonderful. In full transparency, I think a lot of it is just kind of learned. It's a skill you have to develop,
Mhm.
unfortunately, through practice. And I don't typically it's pretty uncommon, for me to have an individual who, has come to me on a death, note, but you do have some pretty involved emotional and otherwise situations that you're kind of inserted into, and people look to you as, I'm the guy that, you know, every now and then I know how to make a good leg, right? But I don't know how
Right.
to how to help someone cope. And so
Yeah.
unfortunately it's not, but the reality is like that's not something that like you can just use as an excuse. Like I can't just sit here and say, well, that's not my area. Let's transfer you over to someone else. You have to be able to develop that,
Yeah.
and you have to be empathetic. You have to be a people person who, again, back to that attentive listening. I think like that's really the essence of where it all comes down to. Any kind of therapy or emotional mental awareness classes or anything that's worth their salt, like that's the first thing they're preaching is listening. And if you're the guy that's knows all the answers in the room and needs to, oh, you do, okay, let me tell you how to do it. Well, you're just a mouth breather in my opinion, and you know you're not gonna do any
Yeah.
good. So it's just that listening that you just have to develop over time.
Experience teaches you a lot.
It
But
does. Yeah.
so is there any other career like when you were younger, did you have your eyes set? I know you kind of from an early age knew this is what you want to do, but was there something else that got your attention for a while that you thought you may take a different career path or something that if you could go back, you think would be something you would enjoy doing?
Well, I definitely wouldn't do anything different. That much I do know. I love what I'm doing. I've spent too much time and money getting to where
Yeah.
I'm at to ever even entertain the idea of doing anything differently. Thankfully, and I'm there's a handful of individuals, as with most industries, that they spend a lot of time and resources getting to where they want to be, and then find that's not where they want to be. Thankfully, that wasn't the case for me. I love where I'm at, but if I were to do anything different, say just this field didn't, ever evolve into a career that I wanted to get into, I really don't know. I think I went through different phases of, I worked for Delta Airlines for like 4 years, 4 or 5 years in Oklahoma City before I went to grad school. And so there for a while, it was just a couple months. I kind of kicked the tires on, do I really want to go be broke for the next 2.5 years, or do I want to
Hmm.
work my way up with a pretty massive corporation? But I knew that this is what I want to do. I think paramedic has also been something that, probably on a more realistic level, has always been something that naturally have been gravitated towards as a plan B. But I also don't, it's funny, I don't do super great with like blood and needles. So, and you probably would expect the opposite for
Well,
someone who like assesses limbs that have been cut off. But paramedics, you kind of
yeah.
have to be good with blood needles. And so I don't know how well I would have been in that field. Uh,
Might want to put a pin in that one. I think as someone who's spent a lot of time in the back of an ambulance in my line of work, it's definitely two things that you'll see a lot of is blood and needles. So,
yeah, it's what I
but
hear. So.
well, I'm really glad that you're obviously passionate about what you do, and you have the firsthand experience, and it gives you um I want to say a leg up, but that I don't really mean that quite like that. But you know what I'm saying? That you have an advantage. Apologies to anybody out there if that offended you, but you have an advantage where you know where these people are coming from, and it's that kind of ability to bridge that gap when someone comes in looking for your help. You just have that extra touch that you can give them, and I can see the trust. It would be you're valid, you're authentic right from the very beginning. And you obviously know what you're doing and you're passionate about it. So you're the type of person that needs to be doing exactly what you're doing. So I commend you for your hard work and your education and everything getting here.
Well, I appreciate that, Tim. I would add a little bit to that. Just because you tear your ACL doesn't make you, a physical therapist, or just because you have a heart surgery doesn't
Yeah.
mean you're a heart surgeon. And like I said at the beginning of this thing, I recognize that I am one of the very, very few amputees in the population at large that having an amputation has in many ways enhanced my career. And I know that that's just not the case for most folks. And so incredibly passionate about it, but also incredibly self-aware of there can be, I think, an urge for individuals like myself who have an amputation and they're also a practitioner to kind of rely on that experience a little bit more, and they kind of need to make that known, kind of thing. And that's just, really pretty sad, because what you're doing is you're taking the attention off the patient, you're putting it on yourself. And
Mm,
I've got a handful of times where, I mean, I would say 50% of the appointments or patients that I work with, I don't even tell them that I'm an amputee. I don't even pull my pant legs up if I'm in scrubs or something. And then I've got another, half patients that they love it. And we talk about the struggles and what to expect and different things. And, some patients, they like golfing or something like that that I'm into. And so, hey, this is how I do it, And so it's just kind of it's a delicate balance of how much you talk about it. But typically I let the patient lead that conversation. I really try and
yeah.
refrain from trying to uh, bring that up and tell a patient, well, I'm an amputee, so I know what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. You sound like a real a real mouth breather, as I like to call it.
No, I can see what you're talking about. That yeah, it depends on the patient for sure. Hey, thanks a lot, Josh, for letting me pick your brain today and learning all about your education, your career. This was something that I knew very little about, and I think that you represented your company and your career very well. So thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it.
And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.